Hi, I'm Jacqueline Luqman with the Real News Network. The progressive movement is growing in the United States, and in that growth, they're confronting issues that have been long dormant in politics and in society. One of those issues is white supremacy. The question, is white supremacy the most pressing issue that progressives have to face going forward, or is it not? Is something that I'm talking about today with Paul Jay, the editor-in-chief of the Real News Network. Hi, Paul. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
So we see this great progressive groundswell that's happening now in American politics and American society. It's threatening to some, threatening to the capitalist elites, but it's a welcome change for a lot of people, especially people on the bottom, especially the oppressed, the working class, and particularly Black people. One of the arguments that is hotly debated in the progressive movement is white supremacy. Is that the issue that the progressive movement has to address and resolve, so to speak, before it can gain any traction in this country? Or is it something else?
Well, again, listen to me, my little caveat at the beginning, I'm just speaking for myself here. The Real News as such doesn't have like a position on such things. I think the answer is yes and no. White supremacy is an ideology. It exists in the realm of ideas, opinions, the way we treat each other. It's an ideology born from slavery, and not just in American slavery, but slavery that goes back, whether you want to go back as far as Rome and Greece.
Yes.
The origin of the ideology is that you must dehumanize those who you super exploit. You must treat people you super exploit, especially slaves, you must treat them as subhuman. And, you know, whether it's the attitude of the British to the Irish, or the Romans to the Slavs, or the cross-Atlantic slave trade, and black slaves, African slaves in the United States, the essence of it is the economic relationship. You need to super exploit, take away the rights of this section of people so that you can exploit them in slavery without reserve. I mean, the only mitigation of it is you've paid for people so you don't want to kill them unnecessarily because you're losing your property.
Their property.
That's like the only limit there is. Other than that, slave has no rights. Which is you treat people like animals. So the ideology born out of that allows people to think of other people in such a way that you can carry out that.
Right.
That, in American terms, is white supremacy. White supremacy has another role, again, ideological, which is to make white workers think they're better than black workers.
Yes.
And to divide black working class from white working class.
Yes.
And say to white workers, you may think you got it bad, but you're at least, you have the dignity or respect or whatever the hell it is of being white.
That intangibility, the intangible benefit of whiteness.
Of which there is. So it's also to divide people. But to say that a system of ideas is the problem doesn't answer the question, why does this white supremacy keep being perpetuated? What keeps it continuing on in the society? There's no overt slavery anymore. So why do we still have such power of an ideology born from slavery? And the answer is because this system wants to continue to super exploit people of color, particularly black people, and particularly black people who are the descendants of slaves. Because even African immigrants to the United States don't get treated as badly as the sections of the population, like in Baltimore. And,
right.
And you get levels of this supremacy. So an educated African feels superior to black Americans unless the black Americans have made a ton of money. Then they can transcend, to some extent, this. But the underlying issue is the economic relationship And so you wind up, you got to talk about who owns stuff, who has power, how wealth is distributed, but even more importantly, how it's owned. And if we don't keep talking and focusing on that, you can't change the consequences of white supremacy. Because otherwise, what is white supremacy?
Well, I think some people would argue that, yes, that actually is borne out to be true, where even in the throes of class struggle, even in the throes of, say, the struggle of the labor movement, where on most other issues, working class whites and poor whites realize we have much more in common with Black people than we do with the people who we work for. If it were not an issue with just something in the DNA of the way white people, or maybe the way their thought process is conditioned to operate, that someone, anyone, can come in and say, well, I understand that you think that you have a lot in common with them, but you're better than they are. If it's not an issue of, look, this is just how some white people think, then how do we explain that?
It's in the DNA of the culture. You know, we're born, we don't get a choice what kind of world we're born into. You know, we're born into a culture, and in the DNA of American culture is white supremacy. I don't want to underestimate the role of white supremacy. It's not like ideas don't matter. They matter. And you know, in the American psyche, the white psyche, being born into this culture, you internalize this stuff, and it affects how you act, how you vote, what you do, and it affects the left. And It shouldn't be underestimated. Like, I'm blown away when I see how many I must say there's some progress on this in some areas now, but how many left organizations, media organizations.
Which are by default mostly white, but yeah.
Well, that's my point. I mean, 95% white. And the way this white supremacy gets internalized, it's not that people are deliberately not hiring people of color and Blacks into these left organizations or media organizations or such. But it's so internalized, you don't even see it. You don't even see. You look out and you don't see a sea of white faces.
Right.
And that it doesn't impact you.
And people don't think, okay, there's something wrong. Literally, people don't think there's something wrong with this picture, that everyone looks the same and there is no, I don't like to overuse the word, but diversity represented in this organization. And that's fine. I think I agree with that. That makes sense for most cases. But when we have a society in which the data shows that Black people with a college degree are paid less than white people with the same level of education, with the same amount of time with a work history. Black college graduates are twice as likely to be unemployed as white college graduates. When we look at employment discrimination outside of college degrees, if someone has an ethnic sounding name, they're less likely to get a call back when they apply for a job. So these are things that are not subconscious or unconscious reactions.
It could be both.
Yeah, so what do we do?
Everything you just said is an economic relationship. Everything you just said is a way to take advantage of people and use the ideology of white supremacy to justify it. And like, I'm not saying there, you know, clearly this white supremacy permeates people's psyche in this country, white people's psyche. Clearly, as I say, it's a culture, you know, born out of slavery. But how do we change it? There was an interesting a few sentences, I can't quote it exactly, but when Black Lives Matter put out their programmatic document, they had a paragraph that kind of dealt with this. And they said, yeah, you know, racism amongst working people and such, you know, it's a problem, but we shouldn't get I'm not quoting it exactly, but we shouldn't get hung up on this, because, you know, it's not our mission to go change the heads of a bunch of white people.
Right.
We need to change who has power. We need to enact legislation that you know, deals with inequality and the economic consequences of this kind of racism. Like I saw a video the other day. There was a meeting of women involved in the Women's March, and one of the women got up and said, "We need to deal with the real problem facing us, the most important thing facing us, white supremacy," and everybody cheered. How are you going to do that? You're going to go, you want to give therapy to a bunch of white people?
And I think
it's about power. It's about ownership. And yes, it's about making sure that, especially on the progressive side, people are mindful of not just, diversification, but even more importantly, conscious and deliberate policy that people of color, particularly blacks, and particularly blacks who were the descendants of slaves, rise to leadership. Mm-hmm. Like, to be mindful of that, because there won't be a healthy progressive movement in this country. It's not about being nice to black people.
Right.
Being in the interests of a progressive cause and the interests of working people, there won't be a decent movement in this country without the descendants of slaves being in leadership. It doesn't mean exclusively.
Right.
But not just to have a nice look that there's some black people around.
Right, right. But actually making decisions on movements, on platforms, on policies, on legislation that affects the lives of people who are impacted by those very things negatively, very negatively, up to this point. So what we're talking about really, what I hear you saying is that it's not about, and this is something that we've always said, black people have said for a long time, it's not about changing your heart. It really is about changing the way this society interacts with us.
People of all colors have to fight for progressive ideals. One of those ideals is against white supremacy, against racism, but it has to be a vision of a future which changes this elite ownership. And just to have black ownership doesn't change it. In Baltimore, you have
because
people
black
talking
capitalism
about that.
doesn't work either.
Well, look at South Africa. I mean, it's not that there isn't still a white elite with wealth and power.
Certainly, that actually controls the economy.
There's a black elite that owns enormous sections of the South African economy
and are just as corrupt.
Because it's the system. You can't have this system of, minuscule section of the population having private ownership over the mass sections of the economy. And if we don't focus on that, and we just focus on this formulation about white supremacy, one, it doesn't get to real solutions because it doesn't change who has power. And two, there's no winning without getting large sections of the white working class on board with this bigger vision.
Absolutely true. This is a fine line that we have to walk in the progressive movement between challenging power and addressing the real world implications of white supremacy. And if we're going to win in the progressive movement, we have to walk that line between the two. And thank you very much, Paul J., for coming and talking to me today about this issue. And I am Jacqueline Luqman for the Real News Network.